Hi there, I'm going to share a scripture reflection for the week. It's not following the lectionary exactly this time, but I'm going to be looking at the second book of Samuel, chapter 11, verse 1 to 15, and then Mark's Gospel, chapter 8, verse 1 to 21. Feel free to have a read of those and then come back to the video. Early on in the first book of Samuel, when the people of Israel ask God for a king so that they can be like other nations, God warned them about what would happen if they had a king. God says that the king would take what he wants. The king would take their sons and make them go to war for him. The king would take their daughters and make them work in his kitchens. The king would make them work in his fields, and he'd also take part of their crops. And the king would make them slaves. In today's reading from second book of Samuel, this is where it becomes really clear that David has become that kind of king, the kind of king that God warned them of. A king who exploits and preys on the people. A king who the people need to be afraid of because he's above the law. A king who uses the public service and the military to get what he wants and then to cover up the mess. People have said that Bathsheba tempted David, but we really have no indication of that. When the king has the kind of coercive power that David demonstrates, it's hard to know what one of his subjects wants. They often just won't have any choice. Uriah is not willing to participate in the cover-up, but he gets sent to the front lines to be gotten rid of. Israel's king has become corrupted by power. The church shouldn't worship kings. The church shouldn't worship political leaders. The church should be wary of political leaders when they woo us. We should be wary of politicians who offer special rights or special privileges to religious groups. We should be wary of politicians who say, you're never going to have to vote again. We should be wary of when politicians offer us welfare funding. All of these kinds of relationships that churches and Christians might have with politicians can make us want to turn away from seeing the frightening things that they're also doing. Those kind of relationships can make us want to zip our lips about things that we've heard or seen going on. In the story of Jesus in Mark's Gospel, we've been hearing about the house of King Herod, which is also cruel and corrupt and compromised. And King Herod feels threatened by what he's hearing about what Jesus is doing because the people are following him. The people are seeing him as a leader who cares about them and provides for them. And in response, Jesus has headed out into the wilderness to get some space. The people are following him into the wilderness because they're looking for a shepherd. They're looking for someone who will lead them. They're looking for a king. And they're followed into the wilderness just like God led their ancestors into the wilderness and into freedom. Like their ancestors, they're worried about what they'll eat in the wild. And Jesus tells them to share what they have, and it turns out that they actually have plenty, more than enough. There are 12 baskets left over, one for each of the traditional tribes of ancient Israel. The abundance is so great that it's more than enough to feed the whole nation. This is the kind of thing that would make people want to make him king. Later on in Mark's Gospel, we have another story about Jesus in the wilderness, and that's the reading that we've looked at today. And again, there's hungry crowds, and again, the disciples don't know what to do. And again, Jesus is telling them to share what they have, and they end up feeding the crowds of people with just a little bit of food and having baskets left over again. And so some people, when they've read and studied this little story, they've thought that it must be a mistake. They've thought that whoever was compiling this collection of Jesus stories must have not realized that they'd already told this story. I don't think that's the case. I think there's a good reason why we hear this kind of story again. Because Mark has told that kind of story about Jesus feeding crowds in the wilderness, not far from his hometown in Galilee, within the boundaries of Israel. And there have been 12 baskets left over, one for each of the tribes of Israel. That's the first version of that story. And it's saying that there's more than enough to feed all of Israel if they share what they have. There's abundantly enough. But this time, Jesus and his close friends are outside the boundaries of Israel. They've gone up to the Phoenician city of Tyre on the Mediterranean. And this is as far as they ever get from their familiar local sea in Galilee. This is a much larger sea, a much larger ocean, an ocean that connects them to many nations that are a long way off. In that place, Jesus gets challenged by a local woman about whether there's place for her at the table. And Jesus doesn't think that there is, because at that stage, he thinks that he's just been sent for his own people, for the Jewish people. He thinks that that's who he's meant to be working with. And she actually argues with him, and she convinces him that there should also be a place for her. There should be a place for the nations at the table too. And after that, when Jesus goes out into the wilderness again, that's when he feeds the crowds again. So he's now feeding the crowds in a foreign land, and there's still enough. There's still lots left over. This time there are 7 baskets left over, not 12 baskets. And I think that that's because 7 is the number of days in the ancient Jewish story of God making the world. 7 baskets left over means that there's not just enough for the Jewish people, there's more than enough for the whole world if we share what we have. After doing something like this, the crowds might have been tempted to push for Jesus to be king. But Jesus is just saying, beware of the yeast that puffs up. Jesus is not trying to grasp power or puff himself up into a big man. Jesus is not going to lead a revolt like they expect and replace the previous corrupt king. If he had done that, maybe he wouldn't have been executed. But if he had, he surely would have been corrupted by the violence and by the power. We might be concerned by things that are going on in the world politically. And I think as a church, we should be wary of aligning ourselves to politicians or to particular political parties. On the other hand, we might be encouraged by things that we've been hearing about that are going on in politics, but we still shouldn't lose sight of what the church's hope is, because our hope is not in a particular election result, whether it happens here or whether it happens in another country. Our hope is in this idea that God is at work renewing the whole of the world so that everyone can have enough. And our alignment is with Jesus before it is with any ideological or political movement.